Hi, I'm Stephen Carson coming at you from St. Louis, Missouri in these United States. Um, Here's something I don't say often. Please share this and like it and all that kind of stuff on YouTube. I gather that helps, promote the show. And by share, I don't mean like just blast it out on Twitter. You can if you want, but I'm more thinking, you know, you can think of someone who enjoys the kind of stuff we do, give them a personal recommendation. That's really how things grow, I think. Personal recommendations. That's the kind of organic growth I want. Um, I do gratefully receive support on Subscribestar for the show. Look in the video description of YouTube and you'll see a link to my Subscribestar. And that allows me to do things like grab a second copy of the book I'm going to go through today in digital form so I can share it on the screen even though I read it in paper. Um, Having a little budget helps me do these things. So really appreciated those who are supporting me. Most of them, it's just $5 a month. So not expensive. Okay, I'm going to do another one of these crazy shows where I try to do something that probably shouldn't be done in one show. Sometimes I like to challenge myself. This is the Triumph of Faith by Rodney Stark. I just finished reading it shortly before the show. We're going to go through the whole book. I'm thinking about an hour, by careful selection, I hope. There's a lot of stuff that's interesting in here, so the selection is not going to be easy. But I'm like, yeah, don't need to get into that. I've got a main story I want to tell, but I do want to tell it for the whole world. So that's going to take some time. Okay, speaking of that book, am I in the right place? Yep. Okay, let's go to it, because we're going to get right into it. There's a lot to do today. Okay, Triumph of Faith by Rodney Stark. If you have seen the speech I gave in the UK, 2022 now, about a year and a half ago, that was drawn from a different book by Rodney Stark, and I'll share a link to that stream eventually. But that speech is on YouTube, and I'll share a link to that. But let's get right into the topic of the book. I think all is well. Nobody's complaining about the sound. Okay, let's rock. Where's that book? There we go. Okay. So this is a book-long refutation of something called the secularization thesis. And it is quite blown away by now. It's so blown away that I looked up the secularization thesis on Wikipedia to give you a definition of the secularization thesis, and the rest of the paragraph was explaining that no one really believes the secularization thesis anymore. But as usual, experts in the field might know something, and the rest of us, know some or have outdated knowledge. So, what is the secularization thesis? It's the idea that through the lens of the European Enlightenment, modernization, rationalization, increasing use of reason, I guess, combined with the ascent of science and technology, religious authority diminishes in all aspects of social life and governance, or as he puts it more briefly, as Stark puts it more briefly, the demise of beliefs in the supernatural, these being replaced by entirely material or secular beliefs. Now, this is the main thing he's trying to show you is just not so. That we are going through a secularization as countries modernize and get modern economies and stuff like that. There's another aspect to this that he hits on throughout the book and that we'll be hitting on as well, and that is that there seems to be sort of a vulgar Marxism view that got into the social sciences, into the intellectual class, and that's that religion is the opiate of the masses. Specifically, the theoretical claims or the predictions are people turn to religion due to material deprivation, and therefore it is the poor who turn to religion in particular, right? Because they're the ones who are experiencing material deprivation. So it's a sort of materialist explanation of the turn to religion, right? He's going to blow that away too. So get ready. This is fun. Okay. All right. I'm going to skip back past the introduction because he just sort of summarizes what he's going to cover in the rest of the book. Okay, global portrait of faith. So 81%. He starts chapter 1 by saying, we live in a very religious world. Surveys of more than 1 million people living in 163 nations show that, I just want to highlight a few stats here, 81% claim to belong to an organized religious faith. 81% globally. Absorb that. And many of the rest report attending worship services or taking part in other religious activities. 50% report that they have attended a place of worship or religious service in the past 7 days. 50%. 50. Okay, and let me just prepare you. There's a lot of stats in this book, and I'm not going to go into it, but he's drawing from these surveys that have been done, these remarkable surveys that have been done all over the world, that they did every few years for a while, something like that. And sometimes he's blending those results to try to get certain things. Anyway, I'm not going to go into the methodology, but I am going to share some of the book is very much based on these survey results, among other things. As he says here, the deeper one digs into the data, the clearer it becomes. The popular notion of an increasingly secularizing world is not merely wrong, but actually the opposite of what has been taking place. So the prediction was, and this was like starting in the 1930s in particular, is before that, but say in particular from the 30s to the 50s, this would have been a very popular position with intellectuals, that modern times mean that people are going to become less religious. They're not going to believe in actual supernatural stuff. We're too rational for that now, blah, blah, blah. This was all very popular mid-20th century, along with a lot of other bad things like socialism. But anyway, which is related. We'll get to that. So that was the belief. And in particular, there was this prediction that there would just be a collapse of religious faith around the world. I remember reading a book by Paul Johnson. I'm sorry I didn't look up the title. It's his History of the 20th Century, which he wrote before the 20th century was over, because I believe it was published in the 80s, early 90s, something like that. I was reading it in the 90s. And at the end of the book, he said, what is one of the most remarkable things that has happened as we come to the end of the 20th century? He says it's that religious faith has not collapsed. In fact, it's resurged. And even the word resurgence isn't quite right, as we'll see when we come to the case of China. Resurgence is not strong enough, is what I'm trying to say. Okay, so there was an expectation that religious faith would collapse. It has not. It has grown, and we're going to go through and see some of the details of that. So here is what he's drawing on. Sorry, I'm going between paper book and digital book. Okay, yeah. So in 2005, Gallup began conducting annual national surveys in 119 nations, now 163 nations. Oh, it's annual, sorry. Every year they're doing this, making up about 90% of the world's population. So that's the data he's particularly drawing on. In each nation, a sample of 1,000 respondents or larger is drawn, and weights are assigned so the data properly reflect the population in terms of gender, age, education, household size, socioeconomic status, so on and so forth. Anyway, like I said, I'm not going to get drawn down into methodology. Buy the book if you want to understand more. Look up the Gallup World Poll, it's called. Okay, so he does say that you have to study the results very carefully. For example, some people said they had no religion, or that they were secular or atheists or agnostics. And all these respondents were collapsed into a category the poll reported as secular, which you can see on this table on the screen here. The problem with that is that category is falsely inflated. Millions of these, quote, secular people said they had attended religious services in the past week. It's probably not what most of us picture when we think of someone being secular, right? So there's some confusion when it comes to the what they call the nones. I'm not associated with any particular church and stuff like that. That data you have to watch very carefully because it hides some things. Okay, so yeah, right. So this first table is worth seeing. This is worldwide nominal religious affiliations. So this is 33% of the world Christian, 22% Muslim. There's a lot of misconceptions that I hope will be corrected in this stream. One is that probably a lot of people think there's more Muslims than Christians and that Islam's growing faster than Christianity. Both of those are wrong. There's more Christians than Muslims. Christianity is growing faster than Islam, as we'll see later in the chapter on Islam. Obviously, a huge amount of Hindus, 1 billion Hindus, and then Buddhists, 0.2% of the world Jews, and then, as he said, that 19% secular is he doesn't believe that number. That's not quite right. Now, perhaps more useful is this table on the left here, worldwide active religious affiliation. So this is people who are, have you attended a place of worship or religious service within the past 7 days? So this is nice because it gets us closer to revealed preference. I mean, we're having to trust what they say, right? But, yeah, I'm a Christian, whatever, man. Okay, yeah, but have you actually been to church the last week? So this gives us a different set of stats, and this shows 39% of those who are active religious are Christian, 31% Muslim, 23% Hindu. And then, yeah, secular are people going to religious services? Anyway, I don't understand that. That's the confusing part there. Okay, so let's see. Lots of tables. I'm not going to go through all of them. What else did I want to talk about? Yes, growth. Actually, this does get to the Muslim thing here. Okay. So many experts predicted beginning in the late 20th century that Islam would soon pass Christianity to become the largest religious group in the world. And these projections were based on the fact that Muslims had much higher fertility rates than did Christians, and this was not expected to change. But then, and this is where you might need to update your firmware here, Muslim fertility began to decline rapidly. A lot of people don't know that. It already is well below replacement levels in Iran, Syria, and Jordan. And the fertility rate for the world's Muslim population in general is expected to fall to replacement level or below within the next several years. And bear in mind, Rodney Stark sadly has passed. This book is from 2015, so we're going on 10 years ago that he said that. So we may already be at a global falling, total fertility rate below replacement level for Muslims at this point. Yeah, because he said the world's Muslim population in general is expected to fall to replacement level within the next several years, and we're in that future 9 years later. Okay, so that's quite interesting. You might have not have known that. Another reason that Islam is not keeping up with Christianity is Islam was primarily its growth was based on fertility. It generates very little growth through conversions, while Christianity enjoys a substantial conversion rate, especially in nations located in what Philip Jenkins describes as the global south. That's Asia, Sub-Saharan Africa, and Latin America. It's a little confusing because the global south includes like China, but doesn't include Asia. So don't think of it as literally the geographic south. It's a term of art, right? So current growth trends project an increasingly Christian world. It just so happens. By the way, that mention of Philip Jenkins, I am not focusing on it today, partially because I haven't finished the book, but he has written a book called The Next Christendom that focuses specifically on Christianity around the world and in particular in the global south. Did I say it right? The Next Christendom. That's what it's called. Very interesting research from Jenkins. I was reading him in Chronicles decades ago, and this book sums up a lot of his studies. And you just wouldn't believe the way the church is growing around the world. Anyway, we'll be getting into it as we go. Okay, let's see. One other interesting detail. People often think of the United States as fairly religious. but that is true only by comparison with most European nations. Church attendance is far higher in many Latin American nations than in the United States, and much higher in most Muslim and Sub-Saharan nations. So active church attendance is the biggest in church or mosque attendance in Muslim nations, Sub-Saharan Africa. Next down is Latin America, then the US, and then, of course, Europe is quite low relative to all of those. Okay, and he's got a table. I'm not going to go through it, but worldwide religiousness, percentage who attended in the past week, percentage who say religion is important in my daily life. And so for the United States, that's 46 and 66% respectively. For Western Europe, averaging across, it's 31 and 45. For Eastern Europe, it's 29 and 53. For Latin America, it's 51 and 79. For Muslim nations, 58 and 90. Sub-Saharan Africa, 71 and 92. So religion is important in my daily life. 90% in Islamic nations, 92% in Sub-Saharan Africa. And then finally in Asia, 44 and 69. I know I went through those numbers real fast, but hopefully you're getting the picture. There's a lot of people attending religious services, considering religion important in their lives, etc. Okay. Let's see here. Okay, a brief note on atheism. You might notice, sorry, I missed it somehow. Where'd it go? There it is. You might notice, if you follow me on Twitter, that I pretty much do not engage with atheists. I don't fight with the Reddit atheists and all that. In my personal life, I have been involved with a couple atheists coming to be Christians. So it's not that I don't care, I do. But as a larger phenomenon, as opposed to particular individuals I'm friends with, as a larger phenomenon, atheism just is not important. Sorry to be mean. And he gives a little section here. In particular, of course, part of the secularization thesis is that the percent of atheists would grow, right? But it never did. Like in the United States, as you can see here, it's 4.4. It's been 4.4 for a long time. It's never really changed. It's never grown. In particular, he says in most of the world, atheists make up only tiny percentages of the population. In only 11 nations do atheists account for more than 10% of the population. In no nation do they exceed 30%. Meanwhile, they're extremely scarce in those super religious places. Islamic nations, Sub-Saharan Africa, Latin America, hardly can find an atheist. So, I think you can safely ignore the Richard Dawkins, Sam Harris, Daniel Dennett, Christopher Hitchens stuff myself. It's just not that big a part of the story of what's going on in the world. They may have thought that they were, going to push for atheism to finally conquer everything, but in fact they were doing a rearguard action. By the time the new atheists were publishing their books, the worldwide resurgence of religion had already been very, very well established. I don't know if they knew that, or maybe that's why they were doing it, because they were freaking out about it. I don't know. I don't know that much about them. But anyway, okay. So finally, finishing up chapter 1, which is just a global survey. The world today is far more religious than it was back in 1950, and that's particularly when that was sort of the height of, people thinking that atheism was going to take over, secularization, all that. In 1950, there were about 5 million Christians in China. Today, there are about 100 million, and millions more are converted every year. In 1950, mass attendance in Latin America was low, probably not higher than 20% a week anywhere. Today, it is more than 50% in many Latin nations, and we'll focus on that in that chapter. Even in Islam, mosque attendance was far lower in the 1950s, and many Muslim laws were far less carefully observed. In short, a great religious awakening has taken place around the world. And so that is what we're going to do. We are going to go on a crazy fast tour around the world and survey the situation. My wife says Muslim fertility in India has dropped from 3.4 kids per family in 2006 to 2.6 in 2019. So yeah, rapid shifts on this stuff. Okay, so Europe. let's see. Yeah, so I think it was Europe in particular that let some people think that the secularization thesis might make sense, because we did see a petering out of religiousness in certain ways in Europe. But first of all, he says that you cannot find a correlation between modernization and religiousness, which would be the suggestion of the secularization thesis, right? It's not just that secularization is happening; it's that secularization happens with modernization. And when you disaggregate, always good to do, when you disaggregate and look at country by country and so forth in Europe, you find that you cannot find any correlation between modernization and a decline in religiousness. Okay, so that's very important point number one, and he gives you the negative correlations in the book and all that. Okay, so one of the reasons that we have a misperception of Europe is because we have a misperception of my beloved Middle Ages. He's about to throw ice on the medieval anarchy I'm always talking about, right? Few attended church during medieval times. This is well known among historians at this point. Through most of this era, when more than 90% of Europe's population lived in rural areas, churches were only to be found in towns and cities. Therefore, hardly anyone could have attended church. There just wasn't even a church near, that you could get to practically for most of the European population. Largely agricultural throughout that era, of course, right? Most of the population would have been. Yeah, and then there's few stats, but there's a lot of trustworthy reports from many times and places, and these reports are in amazing agreement that the great majority of ordinary people seldom, if ever, went to church. As Michael Walzer put it, medieval society was largely composed of non-participants in the churches. So, we see the cathedrals from the Middle Ages, and we're like, such a religious people. Well, that's not really the whole story. Now, I'm going to not quote as much as I'd like, because I'm trying to move fast, but there are some hilarious quotes here in this section about medieval piety and the misbehavior when they would bother to go to church. We'll see what I decide to cover. We'll get to it. Okay, so medieval church attendance, it should be noted for my UK friends, was still more irregular in Wales, Scotland, and Ireland than in England. Let's see, in 1577, a pastor testified that he often quits his church without preaching because not a soul has turned up to hear him. In 1572, someone said, pastors face near empty churches. 1580s, in Braunschweig-Grubenhagen, many churches are empty on Sundays. But as Stark says, it is not clear that having a large turnout at Sunday services would have been desirable. That's because when people did come to church, so many of them misbehaved. Get ready for this. The conduct of many churchgoers left so much to be desired as to turn the service into a travesty of what was intended. Members of the congregation jostled for pews, nudged their neighbors, hawked and spat, knitted, made coarse remarks, told jokes, fell asleep, and even let off guns. I have to admit, I haven't been at a church service where someone let off a gun. Another thing that jumped out to me, those who come to the service this is visitation reports from Lutheran Germany, 1594. Those who come to service are usually drunk and sleep through the whole sermon, except sometimes they fall off the benches, making a great clatter, or women drop their babies on the floor. Sorry, I didn't laugh. That's terrible. Dogs accompanied many parishioners inside the church, barking and snarling so loudly. Sorry, I lost my place. That no one can hear the preacher. Okay, so what does this mean? It's hardly surprising most medieval Europeans were completely ignorant of the most basic Christian teachings. One English bishop lamented that not only did the people know nothing from the scriptures, but also they know not that there are any scriptures. um, so, so he says, but let's be careful what we conclude from this. These low levels of attendance and knowledge did not reflect irreligion. Nearly everyone was religious, but theirs was an unchurched religion, one lacking a congregational base and existing as a relatively free-floating body of supernatural culture. As German Gerald Strauss put it, they practiced their own brand of religion, which was a rich compound of ancient rituals, time-bound customs, a sort of unreconstructible folk Catholicism, and a large portion of magic to help them in their daily struggle for survival. So this religion concerned itself little with matters such as the meaning of life or the basis for salvation. Instead, the emphasis was on pressing mundane matters such as health, fertility, weather, sex, and good crops. So many Europeans today adopt an unchurched faith as well, because so many more Europeans embrace Christian doctrines than attend church. The distinguished British sociologist Grace Davie refers to them as believing non-belongers. Great phrase, believing non-belongers. I had to share this, this was in the intro, but wanted to drop this in, from Iceland. A national survey found that 55% of Icelanders believe in the existence of huldufolk, H-U-L-D-U, folk, huldufolk, or hidden people, such as elves, trolls, gnomes, and fairies. Let me say that again. 55% of Icelanders believe in elves, trolls, gnomes, and fairies. Consequently, planned highways are sometimes rerouted so as not to disturb various hills and large rocks where huldufolk may dwell. And Icelanders planning to build a new house often hire elf spotters to ensure that their site does not encroach on huldufolk settlements. Now, we can say various things about this, but describing it as secular would be weird, right? So church attendance may be low in Europe, but unconventional supernaturalism is thriving. Here we see a table, sorry, it's over 2 pages, unconventional supernatural beliefs, percent who agree, oh wait, what's the question? Yeah, whether they agreed with these 3 statements. Some fortune tellers really can foresee the future. That's the first column of numbers. A person's star sign at birth can affect the course of his or her future. And the final column, good luck charms do bring good luck. So belief in fortune tellers, astrology, and lucky charms. And you can see that there's quite a bit of it throughout both Western and Eastern Europe. Higher in Eastern Europe, significantly. So again, there's religiousness, maybe not exactly what you'd picture if you're just thinking of like Christians going to a church, but there's all kinds of different ways to be religious, right? So another counter argument that the secularization faithful, as he calls them, about Europe nevertheless being religious in its own way, is that although unconventional religious movements, cults, may flourish in America and Canada, they are so rare in Europe as to be irrelevant. But that got blown out of the water pretty quickly. A wealth of data showed that Europe had many more such groups, cults, per million populations than did the United States. So I guess our cults just get better press, better coverage, but there's plenty of cults in Europe. Let's see here. Another sign of religiousness in Europe, 6,130 active religious shrines in Western Europe draw more than 66 million visitors a year. Some of these visitors are, of course, tourists, but most come for authentic religious reasons. Then let's see, he has a section on Sweden. I'm not going to go through it in detail. Again, I hope if this is interesting to you, get a hold of the book and read these sections, right? Because you can. I hope I'm giving you a taste for how interesting this is. But I'm just going to be giving you a taste. So Sweden, what did I mark? Yeah, he says to focus on the Swedish churches is to miss the reality of Swedish faith in a kind of private or invisible religion. So again, a lot of alternative beliefs, lucky charms, healing crystals, personal horoscopes, so on and so forth. There's a reason for all this, by the way, why Europe is the way it is, and we're about to get to that. And then in the Netherlands, it says, let's see. Oh, yeah, well, it's just a quote from Tacitus I like. So I'm not going to cover anything there. And then not going to cover Russia in particular. So what is going on in Europe? And that is a thesis that Rodney Stark talks about in some other books. I'm really familiar with him describing this. And that is the effect of state churches. He observes, and I think he pretty much proves, as we'll see, that religious pluralism, that is, where faiths are allowed to contend in compete, so to speak, results in vigorous religious life, and a monopoly state church tends to deaden religious life, or certainly official religious life. So this section is called Lazy Obstructionist State Churches. And this is really his explanation for why Europe is in the state it is. There are Lutheran state churches in Denmark, Finland, Iceland, Norway. The Church of Sweden in Lutheran Church lost its established position in 2006, but the government continues to collect a religious tax on its behalf. Germany has two state churches, the Evangelical Church for Protestants, the Roman Catholic Church. Both are supported by taxes. Their clergy are classified as civil servants. On and on, right? What he's found, and I'm going to tell this story better in the Latin American section, believe it or not, but what he's found is that these state churches really are a killer. You have lazy, unmotivated clergy who are not out there trying to build their congregations and so forth. Okay, so right. Okay, one other thing. I know I'm skipping around a bit. Okay, leftist politics. Yeah, so that is a factor he thinks as well. In Europe, the link between church and state tended to result in church support for the aristocracy in opposition of rebels and revolutionaries. And therefore, to give an example, in 1911, the British Socialist Party officially declared, "It is a profound truth that socialism is the natural enemy of religion." So the success of the left in Europe, he thinks, has had an effect on, say, the church in Europe. But also it was facilitated by the fact that churches were weak in the first place, these state churches. So while support for the extreme left has greatly declined in Europe, the dominant churches, especially the state churches, have become progressively leftist. Of course, we famously know this about the Anglican Church, but many others. And them becoming leftist, this will shock this audience, I'm sure, has not brought them a resurgence in attendance. Okay, then there's Islam in Europe. A lot of concerns about immigration of Muslims who drive trucks of peace over people and things like that. And this Stark has an interesting perspective on this. He says all the political activity, legislation, and media debate surrounding Islam in Western Europe is rather remarkable given the relatively small number of Muslims there. Now, he did publish this 9 years ago, and the situation may have changed, but going with the data he had. This shows the percentage of Muslims in the population as of, based on the Gallup World Poll results, so those should have been fairly up to date about 9 years ago. And again, it's single-digit percentages throughout Europe. Belgium, France, Greece, Switzerland have the most. Switzerland, oh, anyway. Only in Belgium and France do Muslims make up even 5% of the population. It'd be really nice to have updated numbers on that. And then he talks about, Charlie Hebdo and all that sort of thing. Let's see. Then I'm not going to go over it here, but on Twitter, I was sharing the survey results on anti-Semitism, which is coming from the Anti-Defamation League, publishing their Global 100 and Index of Anti-Semitism. And the only reason I shared it, I don't really want to get into it now, is that the Greece number is crazy. In fact, let me just highlight that for the future. Hey, can I? Okay, I guess I can't highlight it. Come back. Okay. Anyway, it's, oh, there we go. Yeah. they came out as 69%. And that's because people are saying, yeah, probably true to at least 6 of 11 items that are things like Jews have too much control over global affairs, Jews are responsible for most of the world's wars, Jews have too much power in international financial markets, and so forth. Okay. And I shared this, and a lot of Greeks found it, and much hilarity ensued. If you find my tweet on this and go through the replies, you might be amused. Okay. So, fertility and faith. This is quite interesting. So, what is replacement rate? It's 2.05. A fertility rate of 2.05 children per average female is required to keep the population from shrinking. One child to replace each parent, and a tiny fraction to cover infant and childhood mortality. Okay? It's well known that European fertility rates are far below the replacement level, even in Catholic nations such as Poland, which has 1.39, Italy 1.41. Were these low fertility rates to continue, eventually there would be no Europeans left in Europe. But if you dig into the numbers, you find some interesting things, as we already mentioned. First of all, in most nations, including European nations, Muslim fertility has also dropped below replacement level, or is expected to do so in the next several years. On the contrary, religious Christian women in Europe continue to have children well above the replacement fertility level, and we can see that here using church attendance to give an idea of how serious they are about their Christianity. If they go more than weekly, that's a fertility rate of 2.74, weekly 2.23, 1 to 3 times a month. Now it drops below the replacement level, but still more than non-Christians, I think. So what does this mean? Well, given a few generations, people who don't reproduce, that part of the population shrinks, and people who reproduce, above replacement level, that part of the population grows, and you start to get a very different demographic configuration over time, right? And so Eric Kaufman explored the implications of these fertility differences in his fascinating book, Shall the Religious Inherit the Earth?, where he followed that. Rodney Stark's calculations show that for Europe as a whole, the religious population will outnumber the irreligious population in about 4 more generations. And in this way, Europe too may join in the global religious awakening, if indeed it really lags behind. So that's Europe, and I don't think I'm going to make it an hour because I've got a few more parts of the world to cover, but let's keep it rolling. I'm just going to glance at the chat real quick. I've been very focused. How common was the baby dropping? Salmiaki asks. Yeah, I know. Makes you curious. Oh, and that's interesting. A.D. Krauser says the unchurchedness followed the Anglo-Scotch-Irish that moved into Appalachia in the 18th century. I'd like to know more about that because that's like my ancestors, right? I think, as far as I know. Okay, yeah. So let's move on to Latin America. Even if you don't particularly care about Latin America, this story has a lot to teach. It's also quite interesting. So, no shocker with Latin America. It's called Latin America for a reason. Being colonized by Spanish European countries like Spain and Portugal, primarily Roman Catholic, right? Official church statistics reported that well over 90% of Latin Americans were Roman Catholics. But, Stark says, these statistics were pure fiction. And of late, they have been used to advance another fiction, that Latin America has seen a massive defection from the Catholic Church. For several centuries, the Roman Catholic Church was the only legal religion in Latin America, but its popular support was neither wide nor deep. Many huge rural areas lacked churches and priests, a vacuum in which indigenous faiths persisted. This should remind us a little bit of what we were learning about medieval Europe, right? Even in the large cities with the wonderful cathedrals, mass attendance was very low. As recently as the 1950s, perhaps only 10 or at most 20% of Latin Americans were active participants in the faith. Reflective of the superficiality of Latin Catholicism, so few men entered the priesthood that across Central and South America, most of the priests were imported from abroad. So that is claiming all these Latin Americans for Roman Catholicism was based on basically saying, well, yeah, of course, Brazil's Catholic because everyone's Catholic here. It wasn't really sound data, shall we say. So, I'm sorry, what happened? Sorry, I wanted to be on the same place on the screen. Oh, there it is. Okay, I'm still on this page. Okay. So, the Catholic monopoly. During the centuries of Spanish rule, the Catholic Church in Latin America was, for all practical purposes, a branch of government. Hopefully you see this is where this is going from what I mentioned before. Many government positions were staffed by priests and monks. The church was lavishly supported by mandatory tithes that the state collected on its behalf. The church also held huge land grants that yielded large agricultural profits. Hence, the church had become the dominant economic force in colonial society by the end of the 17th century. There were no public schools, only those provided by the church. The church did not, however, seize these opportunities to make devout Catholics of the masses. It was unwilling to expend its resources beyond educating the urban sons and daughters of privilege. So they were not missionizing out into the rural areas, right? And then so now let's talk about Protestants. The first Protestants were just in little enclaves of foreign merchants, most of them British and Americans, but no Protestant churches or missionaries were allowed. They were legally forbidden. To guard against unorthodox religious notions, until well into the 20th century, there even were legal bans on the sale of Bibles in most nations of Latin America, which led to the widespread misperception that only Protestants believed in the Bible. What a mess. Okay, I say that as a Christian to my Catholic brothers. Okay. So then Protestants started to be able to missionize. In 1900, 610 American Protestant missionaries were deployed in continental Latin America. By 1923, it had risen to 1,627. By 1996, there were nearly 12,000. To put that last total in perspective, in 1996, many Latin American nations had substantially more full-time American missionaries than Roman Catholic diocesan priests. In Honduras, for example, missionaries outnumbered priests 5-1. So the Protestants are like making a big effort, and the Catholics are sitting there with their tax-funded salaries doing nothing, right? Basically, through much the earlier part of the 20th century. But then, this is interesting, the number of American Protestant missionaries in Latin America has fallen dramatically in the past 2 decades, in the 2000s. In 2004, there were only 5,000. Remember, it had been up to 12,000 in 1996. Why is that? Because they've been replaced by Latin Americans. In many Latin American nations today, native-born evangelical Protestant clergy far outnumber both foreign missionaries and local Catholic priests. This is what, in the missionary world, we call success. Your goal is not to have to keep sending foreign missionaries to a country forever, or to a tribe or whatever. You want them to, what does success look like? Christianity takes root, it becomes part of that people, and they produce their own leadership, right? That's what you want. And so that's what's happened in Latin America with Protestantism. Okay, so now we can start looking at some numbers. Here's percentage Protestant and Catholic. Protestant is the first column of numbers. Roman Catholic is the second. Roman Catholic outnumbers Protestant in every Latin American nation, right? Guatemala is the closest with 41% Protestant, 55% Catholic. But notice that number I just said. It went from essentially zero Protestant in these countries to numbers like to double digits, 41% in Guatemala, 39% in Honduras, 39% in El Salvador, which we've been hearing so much about because of their amazing leader, 34% in Nicaragua, 26% in Brazil, and so forth. So Protestantism, in a relatively short span of history, about 100 years, has grown like gangbusters in Latin America. So the Catholics noticed eventually, and were like, oh crap, we're going to lose Latin America here if we don't get off our asses, right? So they decided to try something. And the first big attempt you might have heard of, it's called liberation theology. Okay. During the 1950s, as energetic Protestant groups began to make inroads in Latin America, some Catholic theologians diagnosed their success as an appeal to the material deprivations of the masses, right? Because that was mid 20th century. Everybody's like a Marxist, as far as I can tell at that time, more or less. So they're like, oh, we need to, appeal to their material needs. Liberation theology was a mixture of Marxism and Catholicism that aimed at mobilizing the poor for their own liberation. And the proposed tactic to achieve this was to unite small groups of lower class Latin Americans into a form of utopian socialist commune. So I'm not kidding. You've heard of liberation theology maybe, but you perhaps haven't heard of base communities. This was the mechanism that was meant to bring the masses into this plan. Base communities were the names for these communes. So they were going to rebuild society from below, from a new base, from these base communities, right? The primary theorist of liberation theology was the Peruvian Dominican priest Gustavo Gutierrez, probably butchering that last name. He redefined salvation, discarding the emphasis on the individual and arguing instead that salvation is collective, taking the form of saving the masses from bondage. Like socialist liberation, right? That's what salvation really means. Gutierrez was a committed leftist who demanded a society in which the private ownership of the means of production is eliminated. He often expressed his admiration for the murderous Che Guevara and explicitly linked his theology to the work of Karl Marx. So you get the idea. So although liberation theology was supposed to be a response to the poverty of the masses, in reality, Catholic officials sanctioned liberationists in their programs to the extent that Protestant groups were making headway in their nations. So it's a direct response to Protestant success. Oh, okay, we better try something. Let's try this liberation theology thing. Probably no more than 2 million Latin Americans out of a total population of nearly 600 million ever became involved in base communities. It was a flop. It has even been suggested that liberation theology had more influence on Catholics in Europe and the United States than in Latin America. Probably the primary proponent of liberation theology today is, some people in the audience know what I'm about to say, Pope Francis, the first Latin American pope. In April 2014, Pope Francis declared on Twitter, "Inequality is the root of social evil." In May of the following year, the Vatican's charity arm, Caritas Internationalis, made the Reverend Gutierrez one of the featured speakers at its assembly. But even Pope Francis seems to have given up on arousing the masses and calls instead for liberation through government decree. So he still kind of believes in liberation theology, but he's not pushing the communes anymore because that didn't go anywhere. So what is his diagnosis of all this? Stark says liberation theology led nowhere because it was neither a revolutionary nor a religious movement. Rather, it involved a weak, self-canceling mixture of each. Contrary to the consensus among social scientists as well as bishops, compensation for material deprivations is not the basis of the Protestant appeal. Okay. So Catholics came up with something else, and this worked. There was an outbreak of baptisms in the Holy Spirit that began at Duquesne, however you say that, University in Pittsburgh in 1967. American priests took it south in the early 70s. They initially called themselves Pentecostal Catholics. Because aside from some distinctive elements of Catholic culture, such as an emphasis on the Virgin Mary, it is difficult to tell Protestant and Catholic charismatics apart. Both conduct vibrant, emotion-packed worship services during which clergy and members often engage in glossolalia or speaking in tongues. Both put great stress on miraculous healing. This is now called the Catholic Charismatic Renewal, CCR, and it has a headquarters in the Vatican. And this provides the backbone of Catholic commitment in Latin America. The CCR has established tens of thousands of weekly prayer groups that, unlike the base communities, have generated intense levels of public commitment. That is, the Catholic Church activated religious motivations for religiousness, and that worked in the way that the leftist thing, the liberation theology, didn't. So what happened then is the Protestants came in, were doing well. Catholics tried to respond with liberation theology, didn't go anywhere. Then the Catholic Charismatic Renewal came along, and that really took off. And so there was an energizing effect of Catholic Charismatic Renewal. In 1960, only 4,000 men in the whole of Latin America were enrolled in Catholic seminaries, compared with 44,000 in the United States and Canada. Right, so that shows you just how nominal the Catholicism was in Latin America. By 2011, this had risen to 20,000. Mass attendance enjoyed a similarly huge increase. In most of Latin America today, Catholics are attending church at a truly remarkable level. In 7 of these nations, weekly attendance rate is 60% or higher. So where Protestants have been more successful, the Catholic response has been more energetic. Competition, right? Religious competition. Take a drink. Salmiaki says, I used to go to a Finnish Pentecostal church. Speaking in tongues with a strong Finnish accent was very interesting. Yeah, and then he talks a little, I'm not going to focus on this, but one of the things he tries to say, he's not trying to just be like, religious revival is all wonderful. He does, I'm not going to focus on it today, but he does talk about various conflicts. As religion has resurged, you have Hindu-Muslim conflicts in India, Catholic versus Protestant conflicts in Latin America, and so forth, right? And they have a question, people who do not trust people of a different religion. Oh, how much do you trust people of another religion? You see these very high rates in Latin America where people do not trust people of a different religion. So anyway, wrapping up Latin America. Yeah, I'm going to go over an hour, sorry. Latin America has never been so Catholic, and that's precisely because so many Protestants are there now. So both Protestantism and Catholicism have surged more or less together by this point. Toward the middle of the 19th century, the massive influx of Catholic immigrants to America brought with them the low levels of participation and concern that prevailed in their European nations of origin. Initially, many of these Catholic immigrants defected to Protestant groups that aggressively missionized among them. But the American Catholic clergy quickly adjusted by adopting Protestant techniques, including revival meetings. And soon the American Catholic Church was far stronger and more effective than any in Europe. And I think to this day, the American, I'm not a Catholic, so I don't know, but I gather that the American Church, has a lot of weight internationally because it's a very engaged, energetic church. And of course, you might have heard about the African bishops and stuff, African cardinals and so forth, so that's another, we'll get to that. It's another one that's very energetic. Okay. Oops. Oh yeah, there we go. So now let's go to Islam. Muslims may never have been as religious as they are today, and certainly not for many centuries. This new piety thrives not just among the masses making up the so-called Arab street, but even more so among the most educated and affluent. He says something about Muslim terrorism, but I'm going to skip that bit. Okay, yeah, so the Great Muslim Revival. During much of the 20th century, all the Western experts, including those employed by the CIA, assumed that Muslims were rapidly becoming secularized, in part because so many Islamic nations were ruled by what claimed to be Marxist regimes. And of course, they believed since secularization was the way of the future and the inevitable result of modernization, the clock could not be turned back. So if it looked like it was becoming more secularized, it would become more and more secularized. It certainly wouldn't become less secularized, right? And then in the 1960s, there suddenly erupted a massive revival of intense and strict forms of Islam. This revival was reflected in a huge increase in the number making a pilgrimage to Mecca. Again, it's great to have this kind of stuff because it's revealed preference, right? People are making an effort here, not just answering a poll. In the 1940s and 50s, pilgrims to Mecca numbered about 100,000 a year. By the mid-70s, it had risen to more than 1 million a year. By 2000, the total had doubled to about 2 million. In 2012, the total topped 3 million for the first time. So this is 40s and 50s, so let's say 1950s. So this is 62 years later. It's popped from 100,000, making that important religious pilgrimage, to 3 million a year. Huge growth. In Turkey, you might know about Ataturk and his secularization changes in Turkey. The revival has succeeded in rolling back Ataturk-era secular measures, like lifting the ban against the hijab for universities, and so forth. The call to prayer was switched to being done in Turkish. Now it's back to being done in Arabic. In 1978, fewer than a third of the students at the elite Turkish University of Ankara held Orthodox Islamic beliefs. In 1991, the overwhelming majority held these beliefs. So that's just 13 years difference. So, it's really been happening, like literally during my lifetime, that Islam has been increasing in religiousness. Oh, here's a good table on the left side. Would you say religion is very important in your life? It went up by 10%, from 83% to 93% from 1990 to 2011. Would you say you are a religious person? From 73% to 84% in those 11 years. So this has been happening in our lifetimes. Okay. Studies show dramatic shifts towards strict Islamic beliefs and practices among Muslim university students in Egypt, Pakistan, Afghanistan, Nigeria, Senegal, and France. Recall that for the Muslim nations overall, 90% said that religion played an important part in their daily lives. And then here's a table. Let's see, that one on the left there. Whenever science and religion conflict, religion is always right. In Qatar, 98% agreed. The lowest one was Turkey, which went through that secularization under Ataturk, right? 70% believed there. This is asking Muslims only. Okay, so, whatever secularization had happened in the Muslim world has more than been rolled back. Western observers committed to the secularization doctrine cannot grasp how these religious developments could be anything but a regression to backward times. But, and this is where you have to change your preconceptions here, there's nothing medieval about any of this. This is a return to the Quran in the way that the Protestant Reformation was a return to the Bible, a turn to the past to look for inspiration, for adaptation to current and future conditions. Those who embrace the strict forms of Islam that flourish today are not traditionalists. These Muslims live the values of the modern city, consumerism and upward social mobility. They left behind the old forms of conviviality, respect for elders, and for consensus when they left their villages. So this is a religiousness that is going along with the development of the modern world, not in opposition to it. It's happening at the same time, right? They move the cities and they get more radical, not radically religious. Anti-Westernism is another important aspect of the Muslim revival. Anti-colonialism, of course, but also inflamed by the immorality of popular Western culture, which even offends millions of religious Westerners. Fortunately, Mr. Stark didn't live to see what we're seeing now. It's even more offensive. Anyway, it is the most educated and modern Muslims who are most offended by this immorality, and consider, the importation of Western culture a problem. In 11 of the 14 Muslim nations surveyed, the most educated have the highest percentage of people who attend mosque weekly. And then I'm going to skip over. He talks about Sharia, which, of course, there's been a big demand for now as they get more serious about their religion. Okay, yeah, and led to Christians and Jews fleeing, again, as they got. And he talks about religious hostility and tries to address the feminists about the veiling, and yeah, I'm going to skip most of that. Okay, so just wrapping up then. Contrary to what the secularization faithful would have predicted, the rise of a far more intense and militant Islam seems primarily to have been a response to modernization. Partly in response to Muslim economic and industrial backwardness, partly in reaction against the forces of secularization. Emerging leaders and movements generated widespread militant commitment to a variety of strict forms of Islam. This intensification of Islam is not a regression into a pious past. Whatever else it may be, this is modern Islam. Okay, so that's that. Now let's go to Africa. Take a drink between sections of the world here. Chris O'Hanlon says he hears an echo. Let me know if anyone else does. It shouldn't be. Okay. So, Sub-Saharan African piety. Okay, let's be real clear what we're going to talk about here. We're not talking about North Africa. We're not even talking about Sudan and Chad, contiguous with the Arab states, long been Islamic societies. What is usually meant by Sub-Saharan Africa is the huge southern region, where as recently as 1900, nearly everyone still pursued a tribal religion. So just about a century ago, they were all like animists or whatever their tribal religions are, right? Today, nearly everyone in that region has become a Christian. Nowhere has the global religious awakening been more dramatic than in southern Sub-Saharan Africa. Consider that among active Christian churchgoers, more live in this region than anywhere else on earth. So I think what he's saying is more African Christians are going to church than all the other Christians going to church in the rest of the world, right? So just a massive shift in Sub-Saharan Africa. An average of 71% of people in Sub-Saharan Africa report attending religious services within the past 7 days. So, what happened with Africa? Well, at first, Westerners tried early on, like there was a Portuguese expedition to explore the Congo in 1485, but they kept having to give up because of the appalling death rates from malaria. And this continued for hundreds of years, that malaria just kept turning the Europeans back from really being engaged with Africa in a deep way. Then came quinine, a treatment for malaria. With the widespread use of quinine, Sub-Saharan Africa was no longer the white man's grave, and the rush of Europeans began. Explorers, treasure hunters, settlers, colonizers, and missionaries. So in 1870, about 10% of Africa, including the Arab North, was under European control. By 1914, this had risen to 90%. So what? 44 years, boom. Europe took over, basically. Only Ethiopia and Liberia remained independent. So there were the countries where there were heavy amounts of Christians already, like South Africa and Ethiopia. They already had large Christian populations. And then there were some places with substantial number of Muslims, Ethiopia also and Nigeria. But nearly everyone else pursued one of the traditional tribal religions, and these traditional faiths offered little resistance to the spread of Christianity. So let's see, and then there were Catholic missions. I'm not going to go into great detail there. Yeah, so given that Britain had colonized by far the largest portion of sub-Saharan Africa, Protestant missionaries, most of them British and American, had a far larger mission field than did the Catholics. They were restricted to a smaller section of Africa, I guess. And so, as most Protestants know, there was a huge missionary effort to Africa in the late 19th, early 20th century. And by 1910, the missionaries claimed there were 12.3 million Protestant Christians in the region. And it was a lot of British missionaries. By the end of World War I, mostly it was American missionaries. Interestingly, this was about the time that the denominations were getting really, really liberal, theologically liberal, it's so-called, and they stopped sending missionaries because they lost their faith in the validity of Christianity. And he explains about all that, and that's quite interesting. But anyway, what happened, though, is that Christianity really took root in Africa. On the whole, missionaries no longer play a significant role in African Christianity. The extraordinary Christianization of sub-Saharan Africa was accomplished mainly by Africans and sustained by new denominations they originated. Europeans are amazed by the extent of American denominationalism, but it is rather modest by comparison with that of southern sub-Saharan Africa. In 1968, he counted 5,000 distinct African-initiated churches, right, indigenous denominations, Protestant denominations of African origin. By 1995, Barrett estimated that it had reached more than 11,500. So they start a lot of denominations. So a key turning point in African Christian history occurred early in the 20th century when the Bible was translated into the major African languages. Philip Jenkins noted, once the Bible is in a vernacular, it becomes the property of that people. It becomes a Yoruba Bible, a Chinese Bible, a Zulu Bible. So once Bibles were translated into the tribal languages, Africans began to study the scriptures for themselves, and they often concluded that various aspects of their traditional ways were legitimate. For example, that the Bible approved of polygamy and slavery. That's a shocker. And belief in the existence of witches. Of course, witches are not approved by the Bible, but it doesn't deny that there are such a thing as witches, right? And it is true that, and I noticed this long ago, polygamy is not explicitly banned anywhere in the scriptures, just for elders in the church, but elders and deacons, but otherwise it doesn't say you can't have multiple wives. So anyway, he goes into some stories about some of the indigenous denominations, a few of the leaders who started them, and they're quite interesting. But I'm going to skip it. Like these founders that he discusses, most of the thousands who followed them have been uneducated and initially associated with a mission organization before they experienced a call. Most of the thousands who started denominations. Most have spoken in tongues, and nearly all have devoted much time and attention to healing. And then he talks about the belief in witchcraft. They oppose it, but they think it's a problem. I see some people on Twitter starting to wonder that same thing. And then I'll just mention passing, women have always made up the great majority of the members of those African-initiated Christian, denominations. Let's see. So although modern sub-Saharan Africa remains overwhelmingly Muslim, southern sub-Saharan Africa was almost completely Christianized during the 20th century. So that's a summary of the situation in Africa. That's probably all I'll cover. Let's see. The Christians of southern Africa pursue their new faith with far greater intensity than they did their tribal religions. 90% of Nigerians report attending religious services within the past 7 days. Just imagine. Even the lowest rate in the region, Botswana's 49%, exceeds that of the United States, which is usually seen as pretty religious, but not compared to Africa. Sub-Saharan Africa. The typical service in Africa resembles what most Westerners would call a revival meeting. The whole congregation participates. They sing, dance, testify, shout, break into tongues, and otherwise fully express their deep religious feelings. Okay, now, Japan. Oh, it is kind of complicated. I'm trying to decide how much I want to cover of it. Basically, Shintoism and Buddhism are widely practiced, but they don't consider these a religion. They're just something they do. It helps if you understand how paganism worked, and like ancient Greek and Roman paganism. You wouldn't be like at the Church of Jupiter. You would just go to the Temple of Jupiter and like offer propitiation sometimes or something. You didn't like belong to it in the way that we think of religion now. Well, that's how a lot of Japanese religious practices are. They do ancestor worship. They go to certain shrines. About Shintoism, he says the Japanese do not belong to Shinto, they merely use it. And he has a lot about Buddhism, which I'm not going to try to cover. Let's see. Christianity has not grown, particularly in Japan. One of the few places, actually, in the world at this point, I think, that is fairly resistant. Do I have the stats up? Let's see. Yeah, there we go. So people do give a Buddhist affiliation, 29%, and a Christian affiliation of 2% of Japan. So it's still quite small there. But a lot of them have Buddhist 88% of households maintain Buddhist altars. So they're not unreligious. They're just not particularly churched, right? Yeah. Okay. So that's, I'm not going to go into great depth on Japan, but if it interests you, it's there. Now, China interests me, so I'm going to spend a little more time on that. So by the end of the 19th century, many sophisticated Americans held Christian missionaries in contempt. As naive fanatics who imposed misguided morality on natives by convincing women to cover their breasts, urging couples to limit their sex lives to the missionary position, and thereby despoiling more innocent cultures. As Mark Twain put it in 1872, Hawaiians enjoyed an idyllic life, quote, before the missionaries braved 1,000 privations to come and make them permanently miserable by telling them how beautiful and blissful a place heaven is and how nearly impossible it is to get there. Twain's always funny, even when he's wrong. Anyway, it also became de rigueur to dismiss the missionary converts as opportunists. The several million who attended church in China were said to be merely rice Christians, cynical souls who frequented the missions only for the material benefits they provided. By the way, I have heard the same sort of thing from a friend in India who said, yeah, Christianity's growing, but it's rice Christians, they're just there they're getting paid to be Christians, basically, sort of dismissed it. So, with the rise of the Chinese, with the Chinese Communist Party coming to full power in 1949, of course, they expelled all the Western missionaries. And then with the launch of the Cultural Revolution in 1966, they outlawed religion entirely. All temples, pagodas, shrines, mosques, and churches were destroyed or converted to secular uses. Western scholars dismissed the work missionaries had done prior to the communists taking over as ineffective. It was widely agreed among the Western secularization faithful that China soon would be a model of the post-religious society. But it wasn't to be. In the past 30 years, so he's talking about, starting 40 years ago, after several decades of severe repression, religion has been springing up everywhere in China. Millions have returned to Buddhism. Huge numbers of Chinese are pursuing traditional folk religions, worshiping at ancestral shrines. Wherever local conditions permit, religious activities come bubbling to the surface. Meanwhile, with no Western missionaries involved, because they'd been kicked out of the country, remember, tens of millions of Chinese have embraced Christianity. Thousands more convert every day, and scores of new churches open every week, not counting new underground congregations. And I happen to know someone whose mother was part of the underground church in China, and the Christians among you, I'd ask you to pray for him in memory of his mother, who did not get to see her son become a believer, though I know that's what she wanted. He's a very good friend of mine. So again, the folk religious stuff, most Chinese patronize folk temples, but they don't seem to consider that being a religion. I'm not religious. I just go to this religious thing. It's just how people think about religion, right? So they have ancestral spirits, grave sweeping day, the Queen Ming festival, usually around April 5th every year. They gather at the graves of their ancestors, make offerings of flowers, food, and drink, and so forth. This actually was reinstated as a national holiday just in 2008. So that's quite interesting. Let's see, and then he talks about the variant of Buddhism that is in China. Yeah, so I want to talk a little bit more about the rise of Christianity in China, because that to me is sort of the amazing story. The other stuff is basically just the Chinese going back to what they were doing before, folk religions, Buddhism, and so forth, right? But Christianity was there, but it has really grown like crazy in recent decades. It turns out that the Chinese Christians of 1949, that is the ones right when Mao was taking over, those ridiculed in the West as rice Christians, were so insincere that they endured decades of bloody repression during which their numbers grew substantially. As official repression has slacked off, Christianity has been growing at an astonishing rate in China. I knew something about the reality of Chinese Christianity because my father's favorite theologian was a fellow named Watchman Nee. And the last book that my dad and I studied together was a book called Spiritual Authority by Watchman Nee, which I strongly recommend to Christians. Perhaps particularly useful now when many Christian leaders are not to be trusted, unfortunately. So let's see. It's hard to figure out, obviously, with the Chinese government there, but Stark's best estimate is that there were slightly more than 61 million Chinese Christians in 2007. But then, so 2007. Oh yeah, so we kind of think we know how many there were in 1980. That we think it was about 10 million. So the rate of growth from 80 through 2007 averaged about 7% a year. You think about compounded growth, right? That is a phenomenal rate. So why has Christianity been growing so rapidly in China? And I'm dropping frames. Can you guys hear me? Okay, hopefully you can. Oh, not that many frames, I hope. Yeah, looks okay. All right, anyway. So why has Christianity been growing so rapidly in China? Again, in contrast to that view that it's the poor, driven by material deprivation, that's why they get religious and all that stuff. It's opiate of the masses, all that stuff. It is highly tied to the educated in China. A number of observers have noticed the high rate of conversion to Christianity taking place among Chinese graduate students at American universities. And my own church has been involved with ministry to Chinese students in America since I was very young, for decades. Many have also remarked on the very Christian climate that prevails at the leading Chinese universities, so in China itself, where many students as well as many faculty openly express their faith. A survey conducted at the elite Renmin University of China found that 62% said they were interested in Christianity. Christians will be a little cagey in China because they don't want to have the law come down on them, right? But that's a way to indicate interest without getting arrested. Prevalence of well-educated Chinese among urban Christians in China. And he says this is nothing new. In Beijing during the 1930s, Watchman Nee, his numerous Christian converts consisted almost entirely of top honor students from Yenching, Tsinghua, Peking Union Medical College, and Peking University. So why is it so much appeal to the most educated Chinese? The most educated Chinese are more likely than the less educated to become Christians and to reject Buddhism. And he has some numbers on that. Yeah, here you go. You can see that as you go from less educated to more educated, the percent Christians is highest with college educated, and the percent Buddhist is lowest. Well, one thing which I emphasized in my speech, this is the time to drop that link for you guys. So my speech called The Vanguard of Christendom talked about early Christianity, and early Christianity has a lot to teach us about, oh, wait a second. Sorry. I think I dropped the spot I was listening. I'm going to try that again. This link. There we go. Okay. Early Christianity has a lot to teach us about how Christianity can grow in a hostile environment, which the Roman Empire was, right? It is now widely accepted that early Christianity spread first among the educated more rapidly than among the uneducated. Elite theorists won't be shocked here, right? It spreads on among the elite first, and then it filters down. And that's because throughout history, freed of the need to work in order to satisfy their material needs, the rich have sought self-realization. So he says the Marxist Christians, leftist Christians, talk about material deprivation. Well, what about spiritual deprivation? You know, you start to get your material needs satisfied, and then you notice that you feel empty inside, right? Or whatever. Why you start wondering what is the meaning of life? And he goes on to explain more about that, which I won't go into more depth, but enough of a teaser that should interest you, I hope. So just wrapping it up on China, then we'll finish up with, I might skip the Four Asian Tigers and just do America. Because Four Asian Tigers, very similar story. Most of the educated are more likely to become Christians. Church is growing like gangbusters in South Korea, so forth. So if the percentage trend holds for another few years, there will be more Christians in absolute numbers in China than in any other nation. And here's the surprise. He's saying an unpredictable factor is whether, or a factor that would be concerned is whether the Chinese government decides to crack down on the Christians. But an unpredictable factor is that just as Christianity has greater appeal to the more educated Chinese, it has been making serious inroads among Communist Party officials. So what do you know? You've got officially communist, which is officially atheist, right? In China, still to this day. The government, being a member of the party, you're supposed to be an atheist. You've got Communist Party officials who are Christians. But hey, it happened in Rome too, right? Okay, so anyway, he has a chapter here on the Four Asian Tigers: Taiwan, Hong Kong, Singapore, and South Korea. I am going to skip it, I think, in the interest of getting to dinner, and talk briefly about India. Basically, the Hindu revival has been huge. When India became an independent nation in 1947, its political establishment assumed that Hinduism was in its last days. India began to industrialize rapidly, but this was accompanied by a massive Hindu revival. Today, fully 80% of India's population, nearly 1 billion people, identify as Hindu. 67% of Indians say they have attended a religious service in the past week. 85% acknowledge religion as important in their daily lives. Atheists are scarce. India, unlike East Asia, is largely a land of churched religions. Muslims, Hindu, Muslims, Christians, Sikhs, Buddhists, Jains, they all go to church, or almost all of them. And then, let's see. Yeah, so Mirananda in her book, The God Market, says globalization is making India more Hindu. Nanda writes that secularism is retreating and the gods are back, an ever greater force in the private and the public spheres. And again, he uses some visiting shrines and pilgrimages and so forth to give some real numbers, show that people are really acting on these beliefs. Hindu revival, again, is not primarily rooted in the lower castes. To the contrary, everyone agrees that it is especially popular among the more privileged. 60% of middle and upper class Hindus said they prayed every day in temples or in family shrines, while only 34% of the very poor and 42% of the poor did so. So it's the more prosperous. Christianity is relatively small in India, but India's Christians tend to be privileged. And reading about the Sikhs and the Jains was really fascinating, but I'm not going to cover it. But it's there. Anything else? And yeah, he talks about conflict and so forth. Okay, then finally, I'm going to wrap it up with religious America. So nearly all Americans say they believe in God. 80% believe in heaven, half pray daily, 29% pray more than once a day, and only 13% do not pray at all. With this table, you can see American religious affiliation. You've got 78% Christian, 12% unaffiliated, but he says most of them are Christians without a denominational preference. So they just don't identify as Baptist or Catholic or whatever, but they're Christians. So really, it might be closer to 90% of America that are Christians. One of the things he addresses is the idea that, sure, they're Christians, but they don't experience the world as enchanted. Westerners no longer live in a world of spirits, demons, and moral forces. So, although they are not yet militant atheists, according to this secularization guy, today's Europeans, Canadians, and Americans are immune to deep mystical religious experiences, being in tune only with naturalistic materialism, the scientific understanding of reality. That is, he's saying, yeah, sure, they're nominal Christians, but really their on-the-ground experience of life is not a religious one. But once again, Rodney Stark destroys that, and he talks about a Gallup poll, that asks, indicate whether or not you've had any of the following experiences. I was protected from harm by a guardian angel. 55% of poll respondents said yes to that. 55. And this is a great story. Stark says, when I mentioned the finding about guardian angels in passing at a press conference, two different reporters, one from TV, the other from a major newspaper, pulled me aside and in whispers told me it had happened to them. One said that she had been very pregnant and had stepped off a curb and started to fall when two hands grabbed me and put me back on the curb. But there was nobody there. And then he goes into this thing, which I've seen these headlines. Young people are leaving the church in droves. Church attendance continues to decline. Number of Americans who say they have no religion is rising rapidly. The nuns, basically it's all lies and playing with stats as he goes through in detail. What do you expect from our media, right? They grab onto something that goes with the narrative they want, and anyone watching this channel knows what they do. Well, they do it about religion too. Okay, anyway, I'm not sure what more I want to cover. He gets into the mainline churches and modernist theology, Paul Tillich, and so forth. Some very funny bits here, I think. And how the modernists were very much believers in the socialist revolution. The mainline clergy. Mainline refers to the denominations that had been like the really respectable denominations in America earlier on in American history. But basically their clergy apostatized is the word I would use. And so regular American Christians have been leaving those churches in droves and going to non-denominational evangelical churches like the one my father started here in St. Louis, and other things. This I didn't know. The Jewish revival of Jewish religiousness, and in particular that fertility, Orthodox Jews and ultra-Orthodox Jews are reproducing at such a rate, and secularized Reformed Jews are reproducing at such a low rate that Jews are going to be mostly religious just by virtue of demographic shift. Belief in angels is nearly universal in America. 3/4 of Americans believe in Satan. Most Americans believe it is possible to be possessed by demons, including myself, through personal experience. I wasn't possessed, but a friend was. Okay, so let's wrap this up. I know I'm zooming through this, but I just felt like running through it fast. He wraps it up, why faith endures. And he explains that, look, most people feel like, he says there's sort of an on-the-street intelligent design thing. Most people feel that the world is too obviously created, and so they have a yearning for the supernatural. And he says the supernatural is a plausible source of many things humans greatly desire, some of which are otherwise unobtainable. And he addresses this charge that to be religious is to be irrational. And he argues against that claim. He says two rather different claims involved in the charge that it is irrational to be religious. One is that religious beliefs are in and of themselves irrational because they are demonstrably untrue. The second is that people do not reason about their religious choices, but simply take them for granted based on the culture into which they are born. Both claims are easily exposed as false. And again, just whetting your appetite for what he covers there. And yeah, so I'm just going to wrap it up with his final thing here. Global religious awakening. Never before have 4 out of 5 people on earth claimed to belong to one of the great world faiths. And that's where we are now. Only in parts of Europe are the churches still rather empty, but this is not the reliable sign of secularization it has long been said to be. It is rather a sign of lazy clergy and unsuitable established religions. As has been said, Europe is a continent of believing non-belongers. Secularists have been predicting the imminent demise of religion for centuries. They have always been wrong, and their claims today are no different. It is their unshakable faith in secularization that may be the most irrational of all beliefs. Okay, so anything I'm gonna hit here? Let's see. Just checking for. Well, I do want to mention Sam 153 last week. Or wait, oh, just today. Yeah, he said, very informative econ many. So I guess he was listening to last week's and sent a donation in through Subscribestar, a tip on top of his regular support for the show. Thank you very much, Sam. And let's see, nothing there. Then I'm just going to glance over the chat real quick and wrap this up. My wife's called for dinner. Yeah, Salmiaki says, the early mention of state-run churches also matches my experience. Military churches caused me to turn from Christianity for a long time. It was Canadian Armed Forces, I think, or Air Forces, whatever. CAF first, Christ second. Yeah, and, I think maybe Western Europe. Canadian stats are in here somewhere. There's some right here. How often do you think, well, this is just, these are sort of pre-things to religious. How often do you think about the meaning and purpose of life? United States, 78%, Canada, 82%. Percentage, on the other side, percentage who agree that life does not serve any purpose. These numbers are very low. United States, 3%, Canada, 4%. To embrace the new atheist view that, there's no purpose to anything. We're just randomly here. Most people don't believe that. Do you feel your life has an important purpose or meaning? United States, 94%, Canada, 92%. Anyway, some other stats scattered through Canada's covered as well, though it doesn't, I think, get a focus in the book that I recall. But anyway, thanks everyone. That is the main thing I wanted to do today, is zoom through that book. I did want to give one shill to the Old Glory Club that I am a part of. And we have a stream every Thursday night, a live stream talking about current events. It's called Pony Express Radio. I've just dropped the link to that. The title tonight is Interviews and Insanity. So I think they're going to talk about the Putin interviews. Did that come out? Anyway, I'm behind on things because I was reading this book all day in between meetings trying to get ready for the show. So, okay, thanks everyone. I hope you found this interesting. And again, that was The Triumph of Faith by Rodney Stark. I hope you found it interesting, and some of you will check it out and get into more of the detail that's in there, because I skipped over a lot of good stuff. I just wanted to give the big picture that there has been a global religious resurgence, and we do not have a secular future anywhere in sight. In fact, it's possible that we might be at the most religious that the world has ever been right now. All right. Thanks, everyone. Blessings. And I will see you next week with, I believe, Black Horse.